Good morning and welcome to Veterans Heartbeat on the Pulse of the Veteran, where we discuss issues of health, happiness, opportunity, and well-being of interest to the veteran community, their families, and the community who honors them.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of Veterans Heartbeat, brought to you by River, the Rural Institute for Veterans Education and Research. My name is Jason Zencraft. My co-host Ed Lisofsky is here with me, and he is the Executive Director of River. We welcome you to a weekly wide-ranging discussion of issues, events, opportunities, and needs in our veteran community. Morning, Ed. How you doing?
Morning, Jason.
We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Farside Signs. They create amazing-looking vehicle graphics that will drive traffic to your business. Follow them on the web, Instagram, and Facebook, or just stop on by.
Good morning. This morning we've got Mike Hopkins, who is a representative in the state legislature. Mike has been one very good ally for the veterans in Montana. He fought very hard for the bill to allow emergency medical technicians to help veterans with their medical care. Good morning, Mike. How you doing this morning?
Hey, good morning. Doing well. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we now officially know that President Trump is coming into town. That's kind of exciting times, isn't it?
Yeah, it should be quite interesting. That'll be a good thing.
So what do you know about his visit? Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's what everybody's talking about.
You know, I don't know too much. I was told by a local reporter that they had confirmed it through some source. It makes sense for him to drop by here in the run-up to absentee ballots coming out. So it looks like, if their sources are correct, the president will be coming down to Missoula here in the next week or so, and we'll be doing a rally here in Missoula.
So let's talk about this. We've had the president in this state 3 times for the election for U.S. Senate. That's kind of unusual, is it not?
Yeah, I think before that we had President Obama here. He might have been candidate Obama at the time a couple of times, and we had Joe Biden here once, if I'm not mistaken. But certainly if you look at President Trump coming here multiple times, Donald Trump Jr. coming here multiple times, as well as Vice President Mike Pence making appearances. It's a lot of focus on the state of Montana.
Let's talk about why that is, if you don't mind, for a minute. I've been trying to analyze this, and I'd like to expand on this a little bit more. You know, one thing you can say about our president, he is focused on keeping his word, is he not?
Yes, indeed.
He said he was going to drain the swamp. And in the veterans world, and you're the budget guy. I know you don't know the federal budget, but I know the VA has a huge chunk of the federal budget. Is that correct?
It's certainly got a lot of funding behind it, yeah.
And Senator Tester has been directing a lot of that funding, from what I understand. Am I off on that one?
Yeah, from committee work in Washington, as well as being the senior senator from the state, gives them a lot of authority.
I know that you don't know the federal level as well as you know the state level, but how is this money distributed? I mean, you know, I know it goes through the appropriations process, but can you kind of explain how that works?
It usually goes through the appropriations process. I'm pretty sure that it's getting funding the same way that everything else in Washington, D.C. is getting funding over the last couple of years, and that's through a continuing resolution, or basically just reapproving past funding levels for future interim periods to get from point A to point B.
I was quoted in the Missoulian this week of saying that he has a way of funding his pet projects. How accurate was that quote?
Well, John Tester has a record of saying one thing and doing another thing when it comes to funding his pet projects. I mean, I don't think you can look much farther than him talking about not taking any lobbyist money and turning into the largest lobbyist money recipient in the United States Congress, House and Senate, or him talking about fighting against the big banks and not accepting money from I think he's the number 2 recipient of bank lobby money in Washington, D.C., and just over and over and over again. So, yeah, he's definitely a bit of a pay-to-player these days.
The new one that just came out, the I-185, that everybody is in a dither over.
Yeah.
The state budget director said that the money from this goes right into the general fund. Is that your understanding?
Well, it goes to a bunch of places, and luckily, I think for all of us, it's outgoing budget director Villa these days. But so I-185 raises taxes on tobacco first and foremost, but then on a number of other things, including cigarettes and the rest of it. The funding for it is distributed according to a formula. Less than half of it going to Medicaid expansion, then a portion of it going to the general fund, another portion of it going to other health programs, health-ish programs, and then other money being distributed to some cessation programs for smoking, as well as a little tiny, itty-bitty little trickle of money going to veterans issues.
Yeah, let's talk about that 4% that goes to veterans issues. Does it go through the Appropriations Committee in the state legislature?
Yeah, that portion will.
So it can't be just a slush fund?
Well, so there's a couple of different ways to appropriate money in the legislature. There's the regular budget, which everything by the end of the session ends up becoming a part of. But there's the regular budget, so we'll put the education budget together, the health and human services budget together, the corrections, judiciary budget together, natural resource budget together, and that's the normal appropriations process. It starts in House Appropriations, goes through finance and claims and the rest of it. And then there's appropriations by bills. So any legislator can write a bill saying, I would like to start X program, which will get funding from Y account, right? And so there's a lot of talk during the last legislative session, as you know, about how to get more money into veterans' health care, into suicide prevention especially. And I don't know exactly if they picked out a specific program for this funding already. If they did, that'll be the conversation in the legislature. But I think more from the conversations that I heard, they were just looking at that funding being a piece of the overall conversation around different bills to address veterans' health care in the state, and especially when it comes to suicide prevention. Well,
the reason I point this out is I've heard that it's the 4%, which comes out to about $3 million, is barely scratching the surface, number one. Number two, Bullock can kind of direct it where he needs to direct it.
Yeah, I mean, if it turns out to be $3 million, right, because there's right now just estimates of the amount of extra revenue that raising the taxes on these products will bring in, and there's a real question around, especially since the proponents of the initiative like to say that it's not just about funding these programs, but it's about getting individuals to quit smoking. Well, if individuals quit smoking and buying the products, then you're not giving them the revenue that you otherwise would from them buying the products. So, but let's say that it brings in $3 million. Certainly every little bit helps. During the last legislative session, we were scratching to find $1 million here, $1 million there. But you're absolutely correct when you say it's just scratching the surface of the kind of money that we need for outreach and for getting services to this community.
Now, one of the things that I've been reading in my psychology program, and I didn't even think about this, but you can legislate behavior, you cannot legislate attitude. So,
yeah, at least we certainly seem to try to be legislating behavior these days.
But the attitudes of a Montana citizen generally were pretty independent folks. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I would say that that's a positive.
So getting all this out-of-state stuff coming into us and trying to tell us what to do, it doesn't go over well in the Montana community, does it?
Yeah, usually it doesn't. But, you know, with all the initiatives this year and all the same thing, I guess it somewhat depends on how you put it, right? Because a lot of, especially out-of-state interest groups, try to not make the fact that they're out-of-state interest groups all that visible to the public that they are campaigning towards.
Anyway, all of this money, it's like sausage making. It's pretty ugly in the back end, am I right?
Yeah, I think if most people took a look at especially with I-185 being a good example. The formula that they've come up with for distributing funds, depending on how much revenue it collects, is pretty darn ugly, and I think most people would be pretty turned off if they got to see the process.
Okay, so here's my point that I'm bringing up about President Trump. When he walked in, he said he was going to drain the swamp. He didn't define the swamp, and most people thought he was talking the swamp in Washington, D.C. Do you think he's trying to drain some of Montana's swamp?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's pretty universal. I mean, when I used to hear him talking about draining the swamp, the first place that my mind always went to was the federal bureaucracy and the way that the federal bureaucracy relates and intermingles with state bureaucracy. I always thought was a pretty big part of it.
You mentioned suicide. We've talked about suicide. I look at suicide as a weather vane of how we're performing in certain sectors like the veterans community. Would you agree with that?
Yep. Yeah, I'd say so.
One of the other promises President Trump had promised was he's going to take care of the veterans.
Absolutely.
He can't really affect it at a state level, but if he sees a swamp, do you think that's why he's coming here so much?
I think it's certainly part of it. And while the federal government may not be able to directly intermingle with the way that state government makes a number of its decisions, certainly when it comes especially to a state like Montana, which receives a majority of its annual budget's worth of funding from federal dollars through federally ministered or federally funded programs. There's a lot more that the president and Congress on the federal side can do to help us out.
So we keep talking about this swamp. One of the things that I did when I analyzed, and I've been sitting here, and I've been on the fence. Most folks think that I've been supporting Rosendale just because he's a Republican. I've sat on the fence July, August. I've talked to a number of vets, and I've been trying to figure out why the hell Montana has such a problem in the veterans community. And I think a lot of people are scratching their heads. Have you been trying to scratch your head as a legislator of what the heck's going on?
Yeah, I mean, obviously everybody's got their own politics, but I'd be supporting Matt Rosendale because he actually means what he says, whereas John Tester just lies over and over and over again. Now, when it comes to the veterans community, I think one of the biggest parts of it is just that everybody likes to give it lip service, but when it comes down to brass tacks and it's time to actually get behind them, get the funding into areas where you're supposed to have the funding, make sure that the promises that you make to people before they go out and do a job are promises that you actually keep, we seem to fall flat on our face.
One of the issues that I kept coming up with is the leadership within the veterans community. And the reason I brought up all of the information on the finances is there's an old rule, he who has the gold makes the rule. You've been in politics long enough to know one of the issues also is access to the decision makers.
Yeah, and I mean, look, you experienced it a little bit last session, right? We come up with an idea of how to get actual health care services to veterans, especially in rural communities. And at first glance, it's a great thing. People are liking it. They're signing on. And then all of a sudden, the next thing that we know in committee, we have the leadership of the National Guard and Bullock's side of the equation, Tester's side of the equation, coming in and telling us that everything that we're doing is terrible. It's going to be the worst thing ever. And that switch gets flipped by higher elected individuals, and people just come out of the woodwork. And it's sad because it ends up destroying what might otherwise be good policy and good legislation that could actually tangibly, materially help people.
Yeah, we're going to attack the issue again. It was the legislation to allow EMTs to help veterans by practicing their medicine through a physician, and it made it through the House thanks to you. 89-11 and just got slaughtered in the Senate.
Yeah, and as you remember, it wasn't just thanks to me as a Republican, but we had a lot of really strong support, especially in the House committee, from a few Democrats, right, that were behind it 100% and were really working hard for it. And then word goes up the chain on the Democratic side, and you flip the switch, and all of a sudden a whole bunch of Democrats are coming out saying it's the worst thing since sliced cheese, and you can argue over why, but I mean, from my point of view, certainly it was simply because there was another piece of legislation that had nothing to do with veterans that Democrats really wanted to see passed, and especially Governor Bullock and Tester and the rest of them wanted to see passed. And then all of a sudden, we're not just left out in the cold, we're taken out to the woodshed. A good piece of legislation that could help veterans dies, so that another bill that had nothing to do with veterans, they thought would have a better chance of passing, but that bill dies too. And absolutely nothing gets done. And, I think it's everything that everybody hates about politics and government.
Well,
that matter.
The point that I'm bringing up is the leaders in Montana in the veterans world, they're willing to fight tooth and nail for their power.
Yep.
And that power has been supplied to him by Senator Tester since he got into the U.S. Senate for the past 12 years. And the problem is, if you're not on that side of the equation, or if you're neutral to the politics, you don't have access to the people that make the decision, and they are willing to crush you like a bug.
Yep, as we have definitely experienced here during the past legislative session. And it's honestly just kind of sad. Government at the end of the day is supposed to be about people. When we make promises to individuals, those promises are supposed to be kept. But when the focus is all about somebody maintaining power and maintaining control at the expense of good legislation and good ideas, getting the job done, making sure the trains run on time, it makes for a government that's unable to actually keep up with its obligations. And that has a real world consequence to it, as we've seen certainly here in the state of Montana and throughout the country.
And I think that's why Senator Tester became a bullseye for President Trump.
Yeah, because it's the same here on this issue as it is on every other issue as well, right? It's one thing to the cameras, it's another thing behind closed doors. It's all about maintaining control and maintaining power, and everybody wants to suck up to the individual who's got the power so they can get a piece of it.
The other thing I know that people have talked about with this whole thing is one of Senator Tester's favorite go-to is smear campaigns and witch hunts. I know for a fact because I've been subject to his attacks, and we can discuss that, but he went after the wrong person. He went after one of the president's friends and attempted to smear him the way that he smears anybody that opposes him.
Yeah, that was a real sad case. But I mean, it's a perfect, crystal clear example of what's wrong with Washington, D.C. and what's wrong with politics in general. It's just there's no longer it used to be that you disagree on issues. Sure, you campaign, you try to get reelected, but at the end of the day, there's a line that you don't cross. There's a connection to reality that you try to maintain. And, factuality, if that's even a word. If not, I'm just going to go ahead and coin it right now. And we've completely lost that. And that was a perfect example of it. Just bulldozed a man's reputation and really helped destroy a career simply for political purposes. Everything that is wrong about politics today. One neat little pack.
Well, at River, we became under federal investigation when the National Guard requested an OIG investigation. For what reason, nobody's told us, but we have talked to a couple of our students who were interviewed by the OIG, and the OIG got upset when they weren't giving them negative feedback on River. And we've been sitting here being in compliance, tried to be in compliance, and they're running around with their power, their badges, saying that everybody's going to jail at River. And we're just asking for what? And nobody can tell us. So I understand how this game that we saw Kavanaugh go through, we saw all of this going on. And you've been working with us since the legislature. Have our books been open to you?
Yeah, there's never been a question that I've had that you guys haven't answered, and and I think another part of exactly what we were talking about on the political front is using the legal front for the same thing, suing people for the sake of suing people. You either sign on to the team or, they try to take your legs out from under you.
Yeah, they use the federal bureaucracy. And if anybody has read what they call a CFR or codified federal rule, once the legislation is passed, then the bureaucracy writes the rules to try to comply with the law. And in Montana, what's it called?
Well, same thing, agency rulemaking.
So,
this is the state level, the federal level.
One of the problems that everybody will, if you read those rules, will agree to is they're not very black and white. They're very gray.
Yeah, I don't think the bureaucracy really does anything in black and white.
So if you're trying to comply with the rules, you're left with who's interpreting the rule.
Yeah, true.
Which leaves a lot of people open to these kind of smear campaigns that they try to pull.
Yep.
So what are some of the things you hope to see from President Trump's visit to Missoula?
I think oftentimes it's really hard to distinguish between the campaign facade and what's actually going on in the day-to-day of policymaking. And I think one of the things that I'm really looking to see from President Trump is along the lines of what people have been trying to do throughout the campaign, which is sort of scraping away the facade that Senator Tester puts up, that he's out there working hard, whether it's for the veteran community or any Montana community, making very clear that what Senator Tester says when he comes back here to run for re-election doesn't actually have any connection to things that he's doing once he's elected and going to Washington, D.C. And I think that when the people of Montana see, you have perfect example of it, right? When Tester looks Montanans in the eye when he's originally running for office and says that he's not going to take any lobbying money, and then he's the number one recipient of lobbying money. This is a handshake state. We look each other in the eye, and it's a contract. Shake each other's hands. I think the biggest thing that could happen, full spectrum when it comes to President Trump's visit in regards to Senator Tester, is just ripping apart that facade. People of Montana can see him for what he's really become. And what he's become has absolutely no place in Washington, D.C., or shouldn't.
You've been watching as a legislator, and I've heard how Matt Rosendale cut his budget. Is that true? Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we were looking to do early on in the session, because there was about $77 million that we had to immediately transfer to the 2016-2017 budget because the governor wasn't willing to cut spending as revenue was dipping when he was running for re-election. So that took money out of what would otherwise be going into the 2018-2019 budget. So we started looking around, and we were asking agencies and we were asking departments to try to find money that they could either push off to another budget year or that they could just return entirely. And almost right away, Matt Rosendale and the auditor's office came up with 25% of his budget. And because he was able to return that was money that was able to go to health and human services programs like Medicaid reimbursement rates and case management, early intervention, Montana disability services, and that really helped lighten the load and the problems that other agencies and other departments were facing. And he was one of the few people to actually do it.
And it was just kind of the same thing when you're talking about pay raises. And I think it shows the difference between somebody that's there to govern and somebody that's there to set themselves up for something down the road.
Well, we're running out of time, Mike. Anything you want to say to your constituents?
What I would say is, look, no matter what you see as the problem in government, the only way that we're going to be able to take an actual crack at it is if people get out and get engaged. Try to get through more than just the 30-second soundbite that politicians constantly want to feed you. The questions that we're dealing with, the problems that we're dealing with, especially in the veterans community, are serious. And we made promises to these people when they signed up to serve their country. They deserve for us to keep those promises to them. So make sure you get out and vote. And I know that I would certainly appreciate having a United States Senator in Montana that actually does what he tells us he is going to do. And that's certainly Matt Rosendale. I know it from my time serving with him in the legislature. And, I don't know how many examples people need before it becomes obvious that that is not John Tester, but it is not John Tester.
Well, I appreciate your time this morning.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me on.
So thank you very much for listening to Veterans Heartbeat. We'd not be able to bring it to you without all the support of the listeners. And thank you again to Farside Signs for sponsoring the show. If you do need a unique vehicle design, swing on by and check them out. Also, thank you to our main sponsor, River. River has an array of services such as veterans-focused education, a vestibular disorder clinic, and now non-pharmaceutical treatments for pain, anxiety, and depression. Check them out on Facebook or on the web at riverofchange.org. Lastly, we'd like to show our appreciation to all of our veterans. Thank you for serving our country and keeping it safe.